Recording. All right, Tracy Sears with DNRC.
Well, thanks, Sam. And I'm excited to be part of the Miles City Flood Awareness Day. Again, I think this is a fantastic program that you have. And as Sam mentioned, my name is Tracy Sears, and I'm part of the DNRC Floodplain program, um, specifically the Community Assistance Program. There's three of us in the program. One of us, an additional coworkers on, Shailia Wingard as well. And rounding out our community assistance program is Anthony Joyce. Um, we try to work with local communities, and we also have property owners that reach out to us from time to time. One of the things that we do try to do consistently is put additional information out there, especially on our website. So I know Miles City has a great website, but if you're looking for some additional floodplain information, please jump over to our website and hopefully we'll have some information for you there as well. As not only am I part of the DNRC program, but I'm also the Montana National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator. Um, and one of the things the Community Assistance Program does is work very closely with local communities and floodplain administrators such as Sam Malinowski and Miles City. So today we really kind of want to just briefly go over the floodplain management, the floodplain regulations and building structures, compliance, and the benefits of community rating system. So we just want to start off, we talk about floodplain management in the nation, starting essentially with the National Flood Insurance Program back in 1968. But I will say, even before 1968, we had tried to figure out as a nation how to deal with this issue that we had called flooding. Most communities were impacted by it. And since 1924, we didn't have private insurance companies. They were no longer selling flood insurance. And so for quite a while, as a nation, this was the top priority is how do we deal with flooding? And of course, what they came up with is what they had originally called the Unified Floodplain Program. When it went before Congress, they really emphasized flood insurance. And I know that Aaron May is going to come up after this presentation to talk about insurance, and we'll touch on it just a little bit. One of the things about that unified program that they talked about was, look, there's four parts of this program, and that's even though they emphasize flood insurance, there's still really four parts to this program. Um, One of them is, of course, flood insurance, but the other one is knowing your risk or that floodplain identification and mapping, and then of course floodplain management that plays a huge role, and that huge role actually falls on that local community, such as Miles City or Custer County. And then, of course, flood mitigation. But as we get into all of this information about floodplain management, and when we're getting into specific information about building in and around these high risk areas, the biggest thing about this program to kind of remember is that the whole premise on this program is to reduce flood losses and flood damage. That was the whole reason this program was established. And I know that we have a lot to cover in just a short amount of time, but I did want to emphasize that in the state of Montana, they were looking at this national program and saying, wait a minute, we as a state need to step up. And one of the things that we need to do is provide assistance to the local communities. We know this program is going to be complex. And so back in 1970, when they passed the state standards for Montana for floodplain regulations, one of the things they emphasized is an entity that would provide technical assistance to the local community. And they said DNRC was going to be assigned that task. The other thing that they did was they took those originally proposed regulations that came out of that unified program that went to Congress and said, we're going to adopt those standards. What ended up happening was Montana is one of three states that have these higher standards. And one of those standards that a lot of you in Miles City are well aware of is this 2 foot of freeboard. Now, all of this information for the state, when we actually adopted this program, occurred right around 1971. Ironically, nationally, what we're seeing is that these higher standards that Montana has had in place since 1971 are now slowly becoming national standards. So we are, HUD just adopted some regulations for any of their programs. And one of the things that they incorporated was this 2 foot of freeboard, same thing that we have in the state. And I know that there are changes coming down nationally. And one of the biggest things that was on there as a proposed change was to bring back that 2 foot of freeboard. And again, even though we see it as a higher standard in the state of Montana, it was actually a minimum standard that was proposed when they were originally talking about the program to Congress. So I think in Montana we'll be pretty good because we've been dealing with that 2 foot of freeboard for a very long time. So when we go back to looking at the National Flood Insurance Program, it's really important to understand that really this is a voluntary agreement. When the community enters into joining the National Flood Insurance Program, they're saying, look, we're going to adopt and enforce these floodplain regulations that meet or exceed FEMA and state regulations. In return, the federal government saying, look, we'll make available flood insurance to anyone within the community. They don't have to be in the high-risk area, but flood insurance will be available to anyone in the community if your community is participating. Also, we'll try to provide some disaster assistance and other funding opportunities. That was that agreement. It's just a basic one, really, between the federal government and that local community. So what are the local communities looking at? They're looking at these areas that we consider higher risk. It's also referred to as that special flood hazard area or that 1% annual chance floodplain. And you guys are well familiar with that and the floodplain within Miles City. But this is just kind of a snapshot of what we're looking at, that high risk area, that special flood hazard area, especially in Miles City where you have a detailed map. What makes up that special flood hazard areas, you have the area that's designated as floodway. And we'll kind of get into this in just a moment. That's kind of where you're seeing the deeper depths and the higher velocities. And then you have an area outside of that called flood fringe. And those are the areas that you'll still see inundation, but it might not be the velocities that you'll see with the floodway. So when we're looking at Miles City, this is just a snapshot of your existing floodplain. That's the area that is considered high risk. The area that's in blue is considered your flood fringe. Areas with a hash mark is considered floodway. So the reason I bring this up is because these areas are tied into your regulations at the local level. So Miles City and Custer County have both adopted floodplain regulations, and there are certain requirements and things that are prohibited in the floodway, and it's the same with the flood fringe. So it's really important when you're looking at doing any type of development in these areas to understand what location you're in. And it's great that you have a good resource, especially in Miles City with Sam Malinowski, and with the county there, it's Mike Rinaldi, and also I think the commissioners help out with this as well. So the area outside of this high risk area that's not identified would be considered low risk, and sometimes it's also referred to as moderate risk as well. So why is it a big concern with these high risk areas? The whole program, that the local floodplain program, the National Flood Insurance Program, it's all based on how do we manage existing structures and new structures and development within these high risk areas. And the reason for this, because they know overall that there's a 25% chance of flooding during 30-year mortgage for structures in these high risk areas. That's not to say everything outside those areas aren't vulnerable. I mean, every property is vulnerable to flooding, but there's a higher chance of flooding in these particular areas. Also, mandatory flood insurance requirements apply to any structures in the special flood hazard or that high risk area, and that's for federally backed mortgages. Floodplain permits are necessary for any type of development. And when it comes to development, it's really clear that development is any type of man-made activity. So if somebody's doing anything in their property, before you do anything, we encourage you to reach out to your local floodplain administrators and talk to them about what you're proposing, and they will be able to provide you some guidance and some information, and that could possibly lead to getting a permit application and going through that permitting process. We also, as I mentioned before, we also refer to those high-risk areas as the special flood hazard area, and in both Custer County and in Miles City floodplain regulations, they talk about the regulated flood hazard area. It's the same thing, it's just provides an opportunity in that regulated flood hazard area to pull in other information that might be used for the management of the floodplains in that particular area. That moderate risk and low risk areas, it's not identified as a high risk area. These again are lower risk. They can account for As you can see, 20% of flood insurance claims nationwide. And I think this number's kind of gone up a little bit over the last few years. And I know Erin can kind of help clarify that as well. Flood insurance is recommended. Now, one of the things that we do talk about, and again, I know that the next presenter is probably going to talk on this too, but any lender can come back and say, look, we want you, if you have a loan with us, we want you to carry flood insurance as well. Now, for Miles City and Custer County, floodplain regulations do not apply in these areas. We do have a couple communities in state that do regulate outside a high-risk area, but it is not Miles City or Custer County. And this area also includes what they would refer to as the 500-year floodplain or the 0.2% chance of floodplain. And as we get into looking at how to build specifically in these areas, we do want to look at one of the biggest issues or items that you'll have to deal with any type of development in these areas. You're looking at that particular project and how it relates not just to where it's located in the floodplain, but also what you're planning on doing and where is it in reference to that base flood elevation. So that's the elevation on that property of where that 1% chance of flood can occur. And really, it changes depending on where the property is located. It's shown on the maps as an estimate, but the exact location is actually of where, or the exact base flood elevation you can obtain through that flood insurance study. And so Miles City also has copies of this flood insurance, of their specific flood insurance study for Custer County. You can access this information through Miles City and on their website. You can access it through the FEMA portal as well. But this will give you information about what are those cross sections, where's the base flood elevation in this particular location. It gives you a data source. It's a really good reference. And again, you don't have to be an expert on this. You can always reach out to your local floodplain administrator. They can kind of help you look at your area and kind of understand what that base flood elevation might be in that particular area. There's also, as we mentioned, the ordinance that not only Miles City has, but also Custer County. They're two separate ordinances. But those ordinances for floodplain management actually list all the regulations that you'll need to do. It also gives a lot of information about what you need to submit, what is going to trigger a permit, which again, any type of man-made development in those high-risk areas. It gives a lot of information about that local floodplain program. It actually even identifies what office or entity is responsible for floodplain management within the community. On our website, and I think Sam has a few of these in her office too, there is a quick guide. It kind of gives a brief overview of all the regulations, and it really correlates to those local ordinances. So if you're looking at what is a substantial improvement, as we get into that, you can quickly find that. Or if you're looking at information on what, somebody said I need an elevation certificate, what does that mean? You can quickly look that information up. And again, Sam might have some hard copies in her office, but we also have this linked online through our website as well. So what does that local floodplain ordinance kind of contain? It's the same thing that we were just kind of talking about. It really does outline the community's floodplain regulations and requirements. It needs to be updated every time the maps are updated, or maybe there's some changes that have come along. And we've seen some in the last couple of years. We've updated our state model, and we're working with our communities to have to update their local ordinances as well because of some of these changes and standards that have been changed through FEMA, or maybe there's something in our model that needed to be clarified. It talks about the local notification and adoption procedure. All local floodplain regulations have to go through FEMA review, and they also receive review and approval from the DNRC floodplain program. So Shilea and Anthony, myself, we work with local communities to review their regulations and send out approval letters as well. And within those local ordinances, the main thing is talking about the floodplain permitting process. And as we mentioned a couple of times this evening, talking about what triggers a floodplain permit. And it really comes down to any type of development that would be considered man-made activity. just again, reach out to Sam. She'll be able to help you. One of the things that's hard about the permitting process for local communities is that there's this federal regulation that states that all, before they can issue, the local community can issue that floodplain permit, they have to be assured that all other local, state, and federal permits were required for that particular and proposed project. There's a lot of materials out there that can kind of help you if you're working along streams. I'm putting out information in Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. In your floodplain regulations at the local level, they do talk about very specifically what would be required if you're submitting a floodplain application. What's the fee? Does it have to be signed? How do you fill out this information? It gives, you know, information about what the community is probably going to be asking you for, and it does really emphasize those other applicable permits. Now, there's some key documents. Again, this is stuff that your local floodplain administrators can kind of help you with. If you have a project, we encourage you talk with them beforehand. That's going to make this the permitting process go a lot smoother for you. Let them know what you're looking and planning at doing. They can help guide you on what information within those regulations will pertain to that particular project that you're working on, and what you need to submit for the community to review and make a decision on that application. I always tell people, make sure that when you're filling this information out, especially that joint application, make sure that you're filling it out and you're addressing all of this information. It should be somebody can pick up your application, whether it's the community or somebody from the public, and really be able to understand exactly what you're proposing and what you're doing there as well. Some of the things that we talk about is, looking at what are some of those steps for review. I mean, I know, like, if, as a property owner, one of the things I look at is I really want to know, like, hey, if I have to put up a fence, what are the regulations that I need to do that, or what are they going to look for? And this is just kind of just a key step in what that reviewer is going to look for. The main thing is making sure that whatever's being done in that particular in your property, it's not going to adversely affect not only your property, but adjacent property as well, and that it's being built safely. One of the reasons we really emphasize this is understanding that any new structure that's built, especially for like residential structures, the lifespan of a residential structure is typically anywhere between 150 and 170 years now. And so it's not just going to be one person that owns that structure, it's going to be multiple people. And so you want to make sure that it's done in a safe manner, not just for the. So when you get into those regulations, one of the things that Sam had asked us to kind of really focus on is the development requirements. And so in section 9, it talks about development requirements in the floodway. Now that's that area that we showed that had the hash mark throughout Miles City. And there's some very specific guidance on if you're proposing any development within that area. One of the things that's really important to understand is that any encroachments or anything that you're doing there, it cannot create what we call a rise to that base flood elevation. So in that floodway, you can't create a rise. And there's a document we'll talk about here in just a second. There's also guidance for different types of uses, such as mining, railroad, highway, and stream crossings, looking at embankments or utility lines, storage of materials, looking at, stream bank stabilization, and also flood control. And then there's also a section on existing residential and non-residential buildings. So I think it's important to understand, and we'll emphasize this here again in just a second, that this program was looking at what do we do with new development, new structures, and what do we do with existing development that was there before these regulations or these maps, and existing structures. The program looks at all those aspects of, like, how do you kind of make each one of these, if somebody's doing any type of development, how do you make it safer for the future? And that's what the regulations really try to get at here as well. So as we mentioned, when we're talking about the floodway, there are some prohibited uses. The floodway is that area where we know can see the deeper depths and the higher velocities. And I understand Miles City has a very unique situation with that island area, and that area being mapped. We have had long discussions on this, and Sam and I have talked about this over and over again too. I wish that would have been a little bit different. But typically, for the most part, when we're looking at a floodway, that is the highest risk. And it's one of those areas you really want to keep clear from development, because they are not only at risk from losing whatever development that they do there, but it could impact other property owners as well. Now, it is different from that flood fringe. That flood fringe, again, is that blue area that you see at the corner of this, at the right corner of the screen here on that picture. Now, the insurance requirements are the same. They still have that mandatory requirement for any federally backed loans, but there are more restrictive floodplain regulations when you're in that floodway. And one of the things that they state in there is that you cannot establish any new structures. Now, we talked about existing structures. They are handled in a different manner. Now, you might be able to replace those. They still have to become in compliance if it's in the floodway. There are a lot of factors that go into it. Again, if you have a structure in the floodway, definitely reach out to Sam and talk with her about what you're proposing to do before you do any excavation or do anything in that area. It makes it a lot smoother and a lot cheaper for you as a property owner to kind of to talk that over with that floodplain administrator. So one of the things that we talk about is if you're doing any development in that floodway, one of the requirements is that a project may be required to do a no-rise certification. So if they're doing new development, one of the basic requirements for floodplain permits and applications is that they have to show that what they're proposing to do is not going to create a rise to that base flood elevation. This is something that the only way that they being the property owner can obtain is by hiring an engineer. This is not something a surveyor can do. A no-rise certification is something that has to be done by an engineer. So again, you might be proposing on doing some sort of development within that floodway. Go back to your floodplain administrator and say, hey, this is what we want to do. Anything that you can do to not trigger this requirement for no rise is just going to make that process a little bit smoother and a lot cheaper for you as well. So as we get into section 10 of the local floodplain regulations, now we're talking about development requirements in that kind of moderate or low risk, or well, I'm sorry, in that flood fringe area. So not the floodway, but that flood fringe area. Again, everything that's all those uses that are in floodway, they carry over. As it says right here, if it's permittable in the floodway, it's permittable in the flood fringe. But anything that you do, the encroachment limit is limited to a half-foot rise. Now, structures are allowed, new structures. Those residential, any residential structures that are being proposed, it's going to require 2 foot of freeboard. And also non-residential structures, not only they have that 2 foot of freeboard, but they can also look at maybe doing some sort of flood proofing. And so it's a little bit different than the residential structure. The other thing to think about is if a property owner is looking at elevating a new structure on fill, it has to be 0.5 feet above the base flood elevation and extend 15 feet beyond the structure. So if they're looking at fill, they also should have the plans included about what they're doing with that structure. Where is that lowest floor going to be? How is that fill in relation to the footprint of that building? These are things that have to be kind of considered. Also, they're going to need to look at floodproofing their electrical and HVAC and plumbing as well. So in that flood fringe area, you're looking at, it's not that you really can't build, you just probably have to build a little differently. I think if all of you that live in Miles City are pretty aware of that requirement. And again, it's this process by saying, hey, we're trying to reduce flood losses and flood damage. It's not going to be just one homeowner, as we discussed. It's going to be multiple homeowners or business owners, and really trying to make sure that what you're putting in now is going to be safe now and into the future as well. And just want to emphasize that a lot of these regulations are looking at, again, in the program, looking at what do we do with new structures? And you can see the 2 new structures on either side. And how do we handle existing structures? And so one of the things that this program tries to tackle is, okay, we're pretty clear on if somebody's going to build a new structure and what they need to do. But let's say somebody has an existing structure. That's something that we're going to get into here in just a moment, and that's going to be called that substantial improvement. But if you're building a new structure, some of the ways that you can do that is elevate either on foundation walls, as long as you have openings. There are some regulations that talk about what needs to be done in that kind of lower enclosed area. And then if you're looking at elevating on fill, we talked about that 15-foot perimeter of that fill from the footprint of that building. Also, there are slope requirements too. So there's a couple of ways that you can look at possibly elevating a structure too. And again, when you look in the floodplain regulations, it really stresses what's required when you're adding fill. And that's something, again, that you can talk to your local floodplain administrator about as well. Now, enclosures that are below that lowest floor. Now, the interior grade or floor in the state of Montana, it has to be at the BFE. And if it's at the BFE, they still need to adjust for that lowest enclosure area, that 2 foot of freeboard. And that's done by actually adding in these flood openings or flood vents. And I know it's something that Sam has talked about numerous times within the community. Now, a property owner does have, they could look at building that interior grate or floor to 2 feet above, and they wouldn't have to do the vent. So there's some things that you can kind of discuss on what's right for your particular project. And again, a lot of these flood openings, one of the things that we talk about is there's certain placement like requirements for that. It can only be, can't be any higher than a foot from either the exterior grade or the interior grade. Again, these are all these things that your application is going to address and the local floodplain administrator is going to have to evaluate. And this information we have that I'm sharing here is actually in that quick guide, and it's also in the local floodplain regulations. So it's really important to kind of understand those documents, especially if you're looking at building a structure in the high risk area. Also, manufactured homes, I will say in the state of Montana, it's one of those things that they look at manufactured homes the same way they look at any other residential structure. They need to be anchored. That's one of the big things. And they just, again, you're looking at if a flood comes along, how can we protect the structure from damage? So those are some of the things that are going to be addressed here. And if you've gotten a floodplain permit before, especially if you're dealing with a structure, one of the things that's going to be required are these elevation certificates. Now, FEMA provides this form, but it's filled out by either an engineer or a surveyor. And it's one of those general requirements as far as if you're going to be putting a structure in that flood fringe area or in the floodplain, one of the conditions that you'll see on your permit is that you have to do an elevation certificate and have that completed as far as showing compliance with the program. And so there's a lot of information. Again, your surveyor engineer, hopefully they fill these out. Sam works really closely with engineers and surveyors within your community. So there's a lot of professionals that have experience doing this, especially in Miles City. But this elevation certificate doesn't go back. I mean, the community require it as part of your permit, but if you have an existing structure, and let's say you didn't get a permit because your structure was built prior to the maps or to the regulations going in place, if you hire somebody to do this elevation certificate for your existing structure, I'd encourage you to really file it with your deed, give a copy to your local floodplain administrator, make sure somebody else has a copy because there's not like a national repository for this. Usually when somebody does an elevation certificate, it's completed and it gets sent off to your lender or to your insurance agent, but they can change. And so you want to make sure that you keep that copy and make sure others have copies of it within the community so it stays in perpetuity. Other things that we talk about too are making sure that, like your heat pump or AC or even your propane tank, not only are they elevated, but they should be anchored as well. So making sure those are things that your floodplain manager is going to kind of go over with you. It's stuff that's located or it's addressed in your local floodplain regulations as well. Other things that are addressed here are what do you do with accessory structures? What's considered accessory structures? How do you, do you need to elevate? All of these little things are kind of put into the local regulations. You have information here in that quick guide as well. Other additional accessory structures include detached garages. The key here is that these accessory structures they have to be on the same parcel of the property, and as that principal structure that's located on that property. So again, work with your local floodplain administrator, kind of help you out when you're looking at, hey, we do want to put a structure or do some development. What do we need to do? So these are just a couple of examples of accessory structures at the detached garage and a larger, kennel as well. And as we mentioned, that substantial improvement. So now we're dealing with, hey, these existing structures. I want to make some home improvements, or maybe I want to add an addition. Well, any kind of improvement, including an addition to a home that increases the value of that home by more than 50% is what we're going to consider a substantial improvement. Now, this determination needs to be made by the local floodplain administrator, but they're going to say, look, as an applicant, you're going to have to supply a lot of information to show that to show what you're doing, and they'll have to make that determination on, is this 50% or more of an improvement to the structure. It's always requires a floodplain permit, but if you hit that 50% or more, what it's going to require you to do is that existing structure will have to come in compliance with those local floodplain regulations, which means it might have to be elevated. This also applies when a home is damaged. Doesn't matter if it's by a flood, or it could be by fire, it could be by earthquake. Whatever damages that home, they'll do an assessment on that damage. And if you're making any improvements and it hits that 50% threshold, it could require that entire structure to be elevated. There's a lot of information out there. I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to showcase this because I know, Sam, you're probably going to have this information up on your website. But the biggest thing is to understand that definitely if you're doing any work, reach out to that floodplain administrator. There's a lot of information about substantially improved and substantially damaged buildings. FEMA has a document on it. It's a really, really good resource. I would encourage you, if you're looking at doing something, again, look at this resource, reach out to that local floodplain administrator, knowing that if you do have, like, let's say you want to do a new addition, if that triggers that 50%, it's going to require that existing structure to also be elevated. And so that is something that should be considered when you're looking at any of those additions and into your cost as well. And there's information on how you can elevate an existing building out there. It happens all over the nation. So it's just really going to depend on your particular type of building. The other thing we want to touch on is enforcement. That is a big component of that local floodplain. The local floodplain program is to enforce those regulations. And this has become a huge hotspot or a huge hot item for, especially like for FEMA and as a nation and at the local level too, because as we're seeing increases in damages from natural disasters, there's a lot of stuff that's being looked at. Like, was this structure allowed to be built? Was it built in compliance? Did they get a permit? All these things come into play when disaster and assistance is being provided. And that happened in the 2022 flood events. That's what was being looked at as well. And it's being looked at all over the nation. Florida right now, 2 years ago, they got hit by a major hurricane. Those areas that were impacted, they have some huge enforcement issues that are ongoing right now. Your floodplain regulations address how the community is handling not just enforcement, but also the penalties as well. And what's intertwined in there is what the community's process is, but also some of the state and federal regulations as well. So why should they do anything here? This is actually from a legal workshop that was presented a few years ago. They talk about it's really that fundamental duty of that local government. It's to protect the present and really to preserve a community's future. And this is when we talk about these regulations and enforcement of it, I just really want to emphasize this is something that's being looked at nationally because as these disasters occur and we're seeing more and more damage being done, they're looking at, wait a minute, has the structure been damaged before? Why are we rebuilding in the manner that could create a situation that's going to put them in more harm's way? they're really looking at how building and construction has gone on in a local community, really emphasizing that. The other reason that local communities are really concerned about this, and this is something that we have seen even here in Montana, it comes down to liability. They start looking at who's responsible. A lot of property owners may not have flood insurance. And so what ends up happening is that they're going to try to recoup their loss any way they can. And so they're going to look at ways. They're going to say, wait, who's responsible? How was this built? They might go after the previous owner if that wasn't disclosed they were in a floodplain. It might, we've had people just recently call us that were looking at the real estate agents and saying, wait a minute, they didn't disclose this. And why didn't they or the property owner disclose that we were in the floodplain? This doesn't, they're always looking at ways to maybe recoup their costs, especially if they've lost everything. And unfortunately, there's a whole business around this. Litigation has gone up substantially around the nation. Like I said, we're seeing it here in Montana as well. And they have individuals and entities out there that are looking at who is to blame for this structure being damaged. And so it's one of those things that communities are well aware of, Sam, and Sam is really well aware of the situation because, again, we just keep seeing it more and more. So the question comes up, what is everybody's role? So FEMA, again, just really administers a national flood insurance program. The state of Montana, we act as kind of a liaison and kind of coordinate with that local community and help them navigate this program as well. But really, that local community, the bulk of this program falls on you at the local level. They're also, for floodplain management, they have a huge responsibility when it comes to flood recovery and responsibilities. So Sam, her whole, if there were to be disaster in Miles City, she would have a whole nother set of duties that she would have to tackle as well. And property owners, after something has been damaged, again, they look at the self-help, they look at insurance, they look at litigation. One of the things that was really eye-opening in the 2022 flood event, if somebody had, if somebody's home got damaged and they had an existing mortgage, there was help out there because there was a presidential declaration. Usually small business association comes in, and what they do is they'll say, hey, we can help you. We can give you a low interest loan. But that means that a lot of property owners, whether it's their residential structure or commercial structure, are looking at paying for two loans. That's the kind of help. And that was eye-opening to a lot of people who didn't have insurance. So there's different things to look at. We always encourage insurance as people are able to recover a little bit quicker. But then the other thing that we talk about is litigation, and we see that happening over and over again, and that's continuing to happen as well. So I'm not going to really go into insurance because I know Erin's going to talk about it. But again, we just kind of recommend it in all flood zones. And one of the things I did want to touch on just towards the end here is looking at the community rating system. As most of you know, Miles City is a CRS community. They're one of our strongest CRS communities in the state. And what that does is provide them or provide every property owner within Miles City a discount on their flood insurance premium, which is fantastic. And what it does is this program recognizes the good work that the city is doing, and it also addresses and provides this kind of subsidy to those communities that go above and beyond that federal standard. And so your CRS program is really, really important because I think this is something that's going to really help out the property owners in the future as we see increases to flood insurance down the road as well. So with that, I am going to go ahead and stop, Sam. I think I went a little bit over, try to keep this, try to minimize it, but I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point.
Any questions for Tracy? She's your best resource for regulations. I think everyone was waiting for the insurance part, Tracy.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to stop the recording here.